for your paper. Title is the shop window of the text, so it's important to get the title right. And one of the major problems, or one of the major fears of our students, is that they may not have enough ideas to produce a text. I don't know whether that's also the case in Finland, but we found that students have difficulty generating content. And we also we also provide some ideas on how to generate content in the first place. Okay, so that's module 1. This is module 2. This text doesn't actually occur in module 2, and you shouldn't worry too much about the German side of this text. Perhaps we can just focus on the English side, and I'll make a few comments about the German side. Perhaps I'll just read out the text very, very briefly. Behind the glittering facade, however, social and political conflicts made themselves felt all over Europe. In Italy, many people were afraid of a communist power seizure and dissatisfied with the peace treaties which hadn't met all of the peninsula's territorial demands. A large number of industrialists, merchants, great landowners and army officers joined the ranks of the fascist extremist movement. The movement even had some sympathizers inside the Catholic Church. In 1922, following his march on Rome, the fascist leader Benito Mussolini rose to power. Fascism was opposed not only to communism, but also to parliamentary democracy, which was functioning only moderately well in those countries where it was in force. The fascists preached order and discipline and systematically silenced their critics. Now, these two texts have been taken from a textbook that was published all over Europe, a history textbook which is entitled The Illustrated History of Europe. So you can consider them as parallel texts, which are basically equally native-like, you might say. What is interesting, if you look at this closely, and I guess this may also concern differences between English and Finnish, is the differences in theme rime arrangement in these texts. Now, theme is that part of the sentence which is given, which is already known to the reader. So, for instance, in Italy, in a way, is theme because it takes up Europe in a past pro toto relationship. Or the movement is already known. It's theme because fascist extremist movement was used at the end of the previous sentence. So the movement picks up fascist extremist movement. The fascist leader picks up the movement again. So all of this is already known information. Fascism picks up the fascist leader, and the fascist picks up fascism. So what we can see here in this English text is a clear sequence, a consistent sequence of themes running through the text. And these themes are usually placed in subject position. And that's a clear difference with German, where you also have new information at the beginning of a sentence. Also inside the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church hasn't been mentioned yet. So this is something completely new at the beginning of the sentence. And this doesn't normally work in English because you have this linear text structure, which I already talked about. In English you usually get a clear succession of themes, and usually you have themes in subject position. Whereas in German you also have new information, rime, in subject position. So that's a major difference between English and German, which you need to get your head around before you start writing in English. Now we've simplified all this in this graph. As you can see, principle of effective information ordering. The initial position in an English sentence should always refer back to or point back to the preceding context. The final position is the high point of the sentence and points forward to the subsequent context. Actually, a very simple principle. It's something that's second nature, obviously, to native English writers, but may be difficult for foreign writers. From this, you can derive 5 principles. The accessibility principle, the principle of end focus, the thematic patterning principle, the principle of end weight, and the initial subject principle, which I'm going to look at in turn right now. The accessibility principle. We don't actually name these principles in this particular way in the book, but they underlie our treatment of English paragraph structure in the book. Because these names are rather difficult to remember for students, so we didn't use them, the accessibility principle and so on. But what do they mean? Accessibility principle. The accessibility principle is make lexical and syntactic choices to ensure that the initial constituent consists of accessible information. So this, in a way, reproduces the system of effective information ordering. Now, what is accessible information? Basically 3 things, 3 possibilities. One, it's given in the previous context, as in sentence 1. Small people never give up. They cannot afford to. Simply pronominal substitution, for instance. Second possibility, it's readily inferable from the previous context. Household goods are no longer built to last. Video recorders, for instance, break down for good after 4 or 5 years. Of course, there should be DVDs now or whatever, but it doesn't really matter. Video recorders is past pro toto for household goods, so readily inferable. Now, if you do not have something that's readily inferable, you need to make it accessible at the time of mention by means of what you might call an anchoring device. An example is given in 3. With the advent of wall-to-wall television, many theatres and cinemas are being forced to close their doors, particularly in Scotland. James McLaughlin and Andrew Clow, 2 of the new breed of Glasgow producers. Now, if you just had James McLaughlin and Andrew Clow at the beginning of the sentence, you wouldn't know who these people are. So you need to anchor them with respect to the previous context. You need to provide an apposition like 2 of the new breed of Glasgow producers. So this is another way of making this information accessible. Okay. The principle of accessibility is complemented by the principle of end focus. Again, this goes back to the principle of, the graph on effective ordering of information. The principle of end focus is place new information towards the end of the clause, preferably in final position. Now, if you combine the principles of accessibility and the principle of end focus, you end up with linear progression, for instance. That's one way of linking sentences in an English text. So the most crucial part of any football match is the first 10 minutes. 10 minutes is then taken up by during this period. The players have to get used to the conditions, the atmosphere, and the opposition. The difficulties caused by the conditions, in particular, this picks up the conditions, atmosphere, and so on, are often underestimated by even the most experienced of players. Players is taken up by they. They come trotting onto the pitch thinking that their experience will put them in a position to deal with anything that the weather may bring. Weather taken up by, but a morning of rain can make any ground treacherously slippery. Slippery, consequently, one slip can be enough to go a goal behind in the first few minutes. So the rhyme of every sentence is picked up as theme in the next sentence, and that's what you call linear progression. You might also get continuous progression, where you always have the same theme in subject position. We had that in the text we just saw at the beginning of Module 2, where you had fascism, the fascist leader, and so on. That would be continuous progression. Now, to produce a readable text, or to achieve particular aims with your text, of course, you need to often combine the 2 principles. And that gives us the principle of thematic patterning. When choosing your starting point for the construction of the clause, take into account the best thematic pattern for achieving your rhetorical aim. So if your text is basically descriptive, for instance, you'll often have continuous progression. And got a few examples here where something's gone wrong. This is a text, for instance, published by the IJsmuseum in Amsterdam, and I guess you'll find it quite easy to spot the difficulty here. The IJsmuseum houses a collection which has justifiably attained world renown. It contains the largest art collection in the Netherlands, continuous progression, the IJsmuseum it. The painting section represents the most important collection of Dutch painting from the 15th up to and including the 19th century, and so on. Italian, Spanish, and other artists are exhibited in a separate room. The print room contains approximately 1 million prints and drawings. Alternating exhibitions of this rich and varied collection are continually being held. Now, there's one sentence here that stands out in a rather negative way, and that's this one, obviously. Italian, Spanish, and other artists are exhibited in a separate room, because usually in the other sentences we have a structure where the container, you might say, is mentioned first, and then the things it contains. And in this sentence, it's the other way around. Now, this might suggest that's probably not what the writer of this text had in mind, because it might suggest that, well, Italian, Spanish, and other artists are not so important. So we need to turn this round to conform to the overall pattern in this paragraph, which is continuous progression. So we might say something like, a separate room is devoted to Spanish, Italian, and other artists. And then we've got the right form of thematic patterning again. Okay, so that's the principle of thematic patterning. Principle of end weight. More or less suggestive of what it means. It means that you should place shorter constituents towards the beginning of the clause and the longest and most complex constituents in final position. I think I've got a few examples of what usually goes wrong in this case. This is again from our collection of student texts. A number of strongly interrelated factors governing the distribution of wealth are involved here. Now, I'm not saying that native speakers don't write sentences like this, but they're more frequent in non-native text. What's wrong here? The long element, we've got an overlong subject here. The long element has been placed in subject position. What can you do in these cases? You can, for instance, use a pseudo-cleft clause to solve the problem. That's why pseudo-cleft clauses, these what clauses, are so frequent in English. You may have noticed that they're more frequent than in your native language. Why are they so frequent? Because they help you to observe the principle of end weight. So you get something like, what is involved here are a number of strongly interrelated factors governing the distribution of wealth first. And this links up nicely now with the enumeration of factors. Or another example, that however one looks at it, the right wing is in disarray will be apparent. You can turn this round by using a dummy it structure. It will be apparent that however one looks at it, the right wing is in disarray. Or how one might go about giving financial support to the victims of crime must surely be investigated. And this is more tricky, but fortunately, for this purpose, you might say, English has developed what you call an extraposition structure. In English, you can separate a noun and the prepositional phrase that belongs to the noun, as we'll see here. An investigation must surely be carried out. So you nominalize the whole thing. So you get investigation. You try to find a suitable collocation, like carry out an investigation, and then you put the long prepositional phrase after the verb. And you get an investigation must surely be carried out into how one might go about giving financial support to the victims of crime. This is a structure that's quite frequently found in the news. You may hear things like a controversy has erupted over or whatever. Okay. Principle of end weight, and the last principle I'd like to discuss is the initial subject principle. Now again, you might say, oh, that's very simplistic. We all know that's what we started out with in year 5 of our English language, at least in Germany, SVO. But it's slightly more complex than this. The principle says, seek idiomatic formulations which allow the subject to appear in clause initial position. Now, again, an example. From 7a, from the analysis, the true nature of the problem became apparent. Now, we might assume that what the writer is trying to do here, sorry, I need to go back. What the writer is trying to do is link this sentence with the previous context. He's probably been, or she's probably been discussing the analysis, and then wants to say, from this analysis, something has become apparent. So the writer has observed the accessibility principle. He's placed analysis in front position. The problem is that, or well, you might say the problem is that he's used a prepositional phrase, whereas native English writers tend to use initial subjects. So you might turn the whole thing round, and then you get the true nature of the problem became apparent from the analysis. Now you've observed the initial subject principle, but you haven't observed the accessibility principle, because now the phrase that's meant to be accessible from the analysis is at the end of the sentence. How can you solve that problem? You find a suitable verb that allows you to place analysis in initial position. And then you get something like, the analysis revealed the true nature of the problem. So that's just one example, of course. Initial subject is often flouted by foreign learners of English, for instance, in cases where you can use make or allow or enable in English. German learners will usually express cause as a prepositional phrase. So you get things like, through this example, the author shows us, instead of this example helps the author show, or through this arrangement, the top tennis players earned blah, 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 instead of saying this arrangement made the top tennis players some of the greatest